Home times, the real battlefield begins when you return home. I used to believe that surviving the war was the hard part, until I stepped back onto familiar sidewalks and realized that nothing in me could fit into the world I once called home. People rushed by, smiling at shop windows, complaining about traffic, talking about small things, while inside me, time seemed to have stopped, frozen in the smell of smoke, the memory of screams, the muffled sound of farewells that never got answers. Each morning was an invisible struggle. Getting out of bed was just another order I followed mechanically, without faith, without energy, as if my own existence had become a burden I carried out of obligation. I avoided familiar faces, avoided conversations, avoided any memory of the man I had been before, because facing that hurt more than any wound my body had endured. There was one day in particular that felt heavier than the others. Maybe it was the cold, or the strange silence that enveloped that morning, as if the world were waiting for something it couldn't even name. I walked aimlessly through empty streets, hands buried in my pockets, gaze lost between cracks in the asphalt, and shadows cast by bare trees. That's when I saw it. A small figure curled up near a dumpster, as miserable, as invisible as I felt. A dog, so thin that each rib outlined his desperation, with eyes that carried the same emptiness I saw in the mirror every morning. For a moment I thought about moving on. It wasn't my problem. It wasn't my duty. But there was something about him, a fraction of broken hope, a silent plea that made me stop. I hadn't saved everyone I should have. Maybe I couldn't even save myself. But in that moment there, on that forgotten street, I knew I couldn't leave him behind. Picking him up in my arms was like holding myself at my most vulnerable. He didn't growl, didn't try to escape. He just surrendered, as if he were too tired to fight anymore. As I walked back home with that small, trembling burden against my chest, a quiet, forgotten part of me whispered that maybe, just maybe, I had also been rescued. Caring for him was, at first, a trial-and-error exercise. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know the right amount of food, the frequency of baths, or even how to earn the trust of someone who, like me, had been hurt too much to trust easily. He barely ate in the first few days, preferring to curl up in some corner of the house, watching my every move with cautious, frightened eyes. Sometimes I found myself sitting on the hallway floor in silence, just waiting for him to decide to come closer. Hours would pass without anything happening. Still, I stayed there, as if deep down I understood that haste was a currency neither he nor I could afford. The nights were the worst. The weight of loneliness seemed to double when the sun went down, and I found myself facing old ghosts, memories that invaded my room like silent thieves. It was on one of those nights that he came to me for the first time, slowly, noiselessly, just dragging his thin body to the side of my bed, lying there, close enough for me to feel his hesitant breathing, but far enough to let me know he still needed space. I stayed still for a long time, afraid to shatter that fragile moment with any sudden movement, and for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep without the feeling that I was fighting alone. The days that followed were small steps toward something I couldn't yet name. There were no miracles, no grand transformations, just simple gestures, a tail that wagged lightly when I approached, a nose that timidly sought my hand, a presence that silently filled the emptiness of the house. I began to notice that the pain felt a little less suffocating when I was busy with him. The walks, the trips to the vet, the improvised baths in the garage. All of it, in some subtle and persistent way, forced me to be present, not stuck in the past, not terrified of the future, just present. And in that silent coexistence, something inside me began, very slowly, to breathe again. I didn't yet know if I was ready to face what awaited me outside the walls of my home. But there, in that small universe we now shared, me and that dog with tired eyes, I found a kind of peace that didn't come from words or promises. It came from the simple fact of no longer being alone. It wasn't sudden when I realized it. It was like noticing that the weight I carried on my shoulders no longer made me hunch as much. One day, while washing his food bowl in the sink, I caught myself whistling a random tune, something I didn't even remember I knew how to do. On another, I noticed that my steps through the city streets were no longer so furtive. Sometimes, I even looked people in the eye, unafraid of being seen. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was a quiet lightness, almost imperceptible, as if some forgotten part of me were beginning to awaken from a long winter. The dog, whom I had named Max, though he seemed as wary of the name as he was of everything else, changed too. He stopped sleeping curled up in dark corners and began stretching out in the middle of the room, as if claiming his space in the world. We traded our silences for presences, and that, for both of us, was enough. I still had my setbacks. Nights, when the darkness seemed to swallow any hope. Days, when the urge to give up whispered louder than any other voice. But in those moments, Max was always there, lying by the door or resting his head on my knee, a silent reminder that even in the worst storms, we don't have to sink alone. There was one morning in particular, one of those mornings when the sky feels grey even in your soul, when I seriously considered not getting up, not fighting anymore, just letting the emptiness consume me once and for all. But then I heard the soft sound of his paws crossing the hallway, felt his wet nose touch my hand hanging off the bed. There was no barking, no fuss, just that touch. Small, simple, definitive. And in that touch I understood everything. I understood that I wasn't just the one who had saved that abandoned dog. He had saved me too. And maybe, if I had the strength to get up one more time, it would be for both of us. It was there, in that silent moment between despair and decision, that our true story began. No longer as two survivors dragging their scars through the world, but as two beings broken in their own ways, choosing to live. And maybe, just maybe, that choice was the bravest act of all. The first time we went out together in the neighborhood, Max and I, it seemed like a small act to the world. But to me, it was like crossing a rickety bridge over an abyss. Each step was a test against the anxiety tightening my chest, against the gazes I imagined judging me, against the old inner voice that insisted it was safer to remain invisible. Max walked beside me unhurriedly, his nose attentive to the ground, as if saying without words that it didn't matter where we were going. The important thing was that we were going together. With every street crossed, every timid wave from a neighbor whose name I barely remembered, something inside me gave way, like ice cracking under the weight of the first spring breeze. Our walk became a routine. Every morning, every afternoon, rain or shine, there we were, two makeshift soldiers on a secret mission of quiet reconquest. Over time, people began to recognize us. A wave here, a smile there. Young children approached to pet Max, and he, always patient, let them, as if he too knew it was part of our healing. It was strange to realize how the world seemed less hostile when I wasn't facing it alone. Not that the fear disappeared, not that the nightmares had left, but now there was something that outweighed the fear, the responsibility for that life that depended on me as much as I, in a way, depended on it. It was Max who pushed me, unknowingly, to cross boundaries I had drawn around myself like trenches. Because of him, I had to talk to the woman at the pet store, the guy at the park, the town veterinarian. Small conversations, small exchanges that once seemed impossible, now flowed naturally, weaving an invisible web of humanity around me. Sometimes, when I stopped to think, it seemed almost unbelievable that it had all started with a chance encounter. On the street, that something so fragile, so forgotten, could have enough strength to uproot such deep-rooted pain. But it was real. With every step we took, every moment Max tugged on the leash and forced me to move forward a little more, I felt, like someone smelling the earth after rain, that maybe it was possible, yes, to live again. Everything seemed to be falling into place, albeit slowly, albeit with uneven patches, until the day the weight I carried in my chest decided to collapse all at once. There was no warning, no obvious trigger. I just woke up one day, and it was as if all the ghosts I'd been trying to leave behind had sat at the edge of my bed, ready to reclaim their space. The shame, the guilt, the suffocating feeling that I was a burden even to the air I breathed. It all came at once, like a flood that sweeps away any will to resist. I spent hours sitting on the living room floor, back against the wall, feeling the house collapse around me, even though the walls remained intact. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, empty, staring at nothing, convinced that no matter how hard I tried, the war I was fighting inside was too big to win. It was Max who noticed before I could even understand. Without asking permission, without hesitating, he approached and pushed his head under my hand, demanding to be felt, to be acknowledged, to be part of that moment when I most wanted to disappear. When I tried to pull away, he insisted. When I turned my face, he leaned in closer. His stubbornness, his silent presence, his warm breath against my skin broke something inside me. And that's when the tears came, not as relief, but as a belated confession of everything I'd been trying to hide, even from myself. I cried until my bones ached, until my throat went dry, until I felt there might be nothing left of me to save, but he stayed. He didn't run, he didn't judge, he didn't look away, he just stayed there, solid and silent, while I fell apart. And when the tears finally stopped, when the pain lost some of its destructive force, it was he who made me get up. He forced me to go to the kitchen, to fill his food bowl, to remember that even at rock bottom there was someone, a life, that believed in me enough to entrust their existence to my hands. That night, as Max slept curled up at my feet, I understood what I had refused to see until then. I needed help. It wasn't about being strong or enduring in silence anymore. It was about surviving. And for the first time in a long time, I wanted to survive. For him, and with luck, for myself too. Seeking help was like tearing my own skin open under the sky. I trembled the first day I crossed the threshold of the therapist's office, as if each step echoed the shame I'd tried to camouflage for so long. It was hard to admit, even to myself, that I couldn't win this war alone. But as I waited, to be called, sitting in an uncomfortable chair, feeling my sweaty hands gripping Max's leash, because I refused to come without him, I realized that this might be the bravest decision I'd made since I returned. Max rested his head on my foot, as he always did when he sensed my anxiety rising, and in that simple gesture, he anchored me to the present, kept me from running, reminded me I had reasons to try. The first conversations were painful, like picking at old wounds I'd rather let fester in secret. It was strange to trust words after so long relying only on silence, but with each session, each small step forward, I felt the weight lessen, not disappear, not be forgotten, but be shared, as if someone were finally helping me carry it. I also started attending meetings for veterans, places where shame didn't need to be explained, where sadness was understood in the tired eyes of others. And to my surprise, I realized that telling my story, admitting my weaknesses, didn't make me smaller. It made me human again. All of this was possible because Max was always there, steadfast, constant. On every new walk, every tough morning, every night when words failed, he patiently taught me that healing didn't come from grand gestures or impossible miracles. It came from staying, from enduring the bad days, from believing even without proof that it was worth trying one more time. And so, without me realizing it, I stopped being just the broken veteran who saved an abandoned dog. I became the man who was saved day by day by a love without demands, without conditions, without promises, just presence. The bond that united us was no longer just about rescue. It was about survival, about the daily choice to stay, even when everything inside us screamed to give up. And in that silent choice, born of pain and sustained by affection, we were, little by little, rebuilding ourselves. Not as we were before, because some wars change everything forever, but as those who know that, despite the scars, there is still life to be lived, and perhaps even shared. With time, almost without noticing, I began to occupy spaces that once seemed forbidden to me. Places where light streamed through the windows, where people laughed without apologizing, where life pulsed without the constant shadow of loss. Max was my bridge. He was the one who broke the ice when I hesitated to start a conversation, the one who drew smiles even from the most guarded faces as we walked together through the town's main square. He was the perfect excuse to be present and, at the same time, the silent anchor that kept me from retreating to the old comfort of solitude. I found myself greeting familiar faces in the park, accepting invitations to community gatherings, risking small talk in coffee shop lines, steps that, to an outsider, might seem insignificant, but to me were silent victories, won with the courage of someone who had already known the depths of the abyss. One afternoon, as we walked, an older woman approached us and, smiling, asked the name of my faithful companion. When I replied that it was Max, she crouched down to pet him and commented on how beautiful it was to see his spark, how he overflowed with life. And it was there, seeing that affectionate gaze on him, that I realized something that took my breath away for a moment. Max was no longer the frightened, wounded dog I had found on the street. He was strong, confident, happy, and somehow, in a way I could barely comprehend, I was changing too. The marks of war, of pain, of guilt, were still there, etched in me like invisible tattoos. But they no longer defined who I was. There was something new growing inside me, something built on the foundation of silent loyalty, timid hope, and the unconditional presence of a being who never asked for anything but my company. The town began to recognize me not just as the veteran, but as the guy with Max. And strangely, I didn't mind. In fact, I felt almost proud, because for the first time in a long time, I was associated with something good, something that inspired smiles instead of pitying looks. Somehow, without speeches, without grand gestures, the two of us together were rewriting our story, one step at a time. With time, people began to approach me not just to ask about Max, but to talk for real. Some knew, or at least suspected, my story, not because I had told it in detail, but because pain, even when silenced, has a peculiar way of leaving visible marks. An older veteran approached me one morning, after watching me from afar for several days, and asked if I'd be willing to talk to a small group trying to help former soldiers reconnect with civilian life. I hesitated, as I always did with any invitation that pulled me out of the safe bubble I had built around myself and Max. But something in that man's eyes, something in that outstretched hand, reminded me of the feeling of Max's warm nose. Against my hand on that morning when I almost gave up, I agreed. The first time I told my story to strangers was like reliving every blow, every loss, every despair. The words came out jagged, uncertain, as if my own chest resisted releasing them. But there were attentive eyes before me, eyes that didn't look away, eyes that carried their own battles, and between one sentence and another, between one silence and another, I realized there was something powerful there, understanding. It wasn't pity, it wasn't judgment. It was something raw and honest, like the lump in the throat of someone who recognizes, without needing explanations, another's pain. Speaking in that small circle of survivors didn't heal me instantly, but it cracked the heavy armor I'd worn for so long. Cracks through which, little by little, light began to enter. Max, of course, was there at every meeting, lying at my feet, attentive to my every move, as if he understood that these were different battles, quieter, subtler, but just as important. He was the first to remind me at every new gathering that I wasn't alone. And little by little what began, as a desperate attempt at personal reconstruction, became something bigger. Helping other veterans, listening to their stories, walking alongside them in their own healing processes, became not just a way to stay steady, but a mission that made my chest, finally, pulse with something I recognized as purpose. Time passed, without me noticing, and instead of collecting identical days, as I had before, I began to collect small moments that carried the weight of eternity. Unhurried walks under the golden sky of dusk, laughter shared with strangers who somehow became part of my story, entire afternoons watching Max run freely through open fields as if he knew that, finally, we belonged to that place. I was no longer the man who returned from war just to survive. Somehow, in a way I still struggled to understand, I had returned to live too. Max aged by my side. His fur, once a vibrant brown, began to show silver strands. His step, once firm and agile, became slower, more measured. But his eyes, oh, his eyes, kept the same silent strength as always. The same quiet certainty that, without ever needing words, said we had done what we came here to do. Resist. Love. Stay. On cold nights, when he curled up next to me on the couch, I ran my hand over his thinning fur, feeling his breathing blend with mine, and I knew with a clarity that needed no explanation that this small being had saved not just my days, but my soul. In one of those moments, looking at the quiet town through the window, I realized that maybe this is what truly saves us. The daily decision to stay, to love, even when loving feels risky, to trust, even after so many betrayals, to remain, even when everything in us begs to flee. I rescued Max from a deserted street, but he rescued me from the desert inside me. And now, as I watch his peaceful sleep, as I feel the pulse of a life that refuses to fade, even in the face of weariness, I know that this story, our story, isn't about pain, or war, or loss. It's about hope, about rebuilding, about two wounded beings who, upon finding each other, discovered that the purest love, the one that truly saves, is the one that simply stays. And as long as there's one more step to take, one more morning to face, one more memory to build, I'll be here. For him, for me, for everything we chose to be together. The years passed, and even after Max was gone, his presence never truly left me. I walk the same streets where we took our timid first steps, and I still see his invisible tracks marking every corner, every park bench, every patch of open sky where we once ran side by side. Sometimes I feel his weight leaning against my leg when I pause in silence to remember. Sometimes I hear his calm breathing when the nights stretch too long. He was more than my dog. He was my beacon in the fog, my trenchmate in the greatest battle I ever faced. Learning to live after the war, Max taught me that true love doesn't promise eternity, it delivers presence. And in his presence, I became someone capable of believing again. In myself, in the world, in tomorrow.